Clara Whitcomb's hands had not stopped trembling since morning. She pressed them flat against her apron and kept walking down the east corridor, past the locked parlor doors, past every room she had memorized like scripture, until her legs gave out and she caught herself against a doorframe that did not belong to her world. The candle in her hand burned low. The room beyond the door was dark and warm and silent, and Clara Whitcomb, who had never in 22 years of living allowed herself one single moment of rest, stepped inside. If this story already has your heart, subscribe and follow me to the very end and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Clara had been awake for 19 hours when she got the order wrong. It was Mrs. Hale who sent her. Mrs. Hale, who managed the Whitaker estate household staff with the quiet authority of a woman who had never in 30 years misplaced a single key or forgotten a single instruction. She stood at the foot of the servants' stairs and said very clearly, "The West Wing ledger, blue cover, second shelf in the study." And Clara, who had been moving since before dawn and had eaten nothing since a crust of bread at 6:30 that morning, said, "Yes, ma'am," and walked. The trouble was that the Whitaker estate had 3 wings, and Clara had only been assigned to 2 of them. She had come to the estate 6 weeks prior, brought up from a smaller household in Charlottesville, after the widow she'd served passed quietly in her sleep, and left Clara without reference, without wages owed, and without anywhere to go, except wherever someone would take her. Mrs. Hale had taken her on with the particular mercy of a woman who believed in usefulness above sentiment. "You'll learn the house," Mrs. Hale had said on the first morning. "Learn it fast. Mr. Whitaker doesn't tolerate confusion." Clara had learned the East Wing and the Central House in 4 days. The West Wing had always been pointed at from a distance. Mr. Whitaker's private rooms. A kitchen girl named Dottie had whispered once over a pot of scrubbed linens. Nobody goes up there unless he sends for them, and he never sends for nobody. Clara remembered that now, standing at the base of the West Wing staircase, with a candle holder in one hand, and the instruction, "West Wing Study Second Shelf," echoing in a head that had grown heavy and slow, sometime around midday. She thought perhaps Mrs. Hale had said east. She thought perhaps she had misheard, but she was too tired to walk back and ask, and the order had seemed plain enough, and she had learned in 22 years of service that the worst thing a woman in her position could do was appear uncertain. She went up. The West Wing was different from the rest of the house, quieter. The floorboards didn't creak in the same way. The air was heavier with the particular stillness of rooms that were rarely opened, and the summer heat pressed thick and close against the windows. Clara moved down the corridor with her candle held steady, checking doors, looking for a study. She found a sitting room, a dressing room, a narrow corridor that turned back on itself. And then at the far end, a door left slightly ajar. Warm amber light spilling thin across the threshold. She pushed it open. It was not a study. She understood that in the first second, saw the desk against the wall. Yes, and the shelves, yes, but also the wide 4-poster bed and the wash basin and the coat hung over the back of the chair with the particular carelessness of a man who lived alone in his rooms and answered to no one. This was a bedroom. This was his bedroom, and she had walked straight into it like she had every right in the world to be there. Clara took 1 step backward. Her heel caught the edge of the doorframe. The candle went sideways in her grip, throwing light across the shelves, and in the half-second before she steadied herself, she saw it, a blue-covered ledger second shelf, exactly as described, sitting not 10 feet away. She stood very still. The room was empty. She could hear that much. No movement, no breath that wasn't her own. Mr. Whitaker was not here, which meant she had perhaps 60 seconds to cross the room, collect the ledger, and be gone before anyone knew she had ever been. Clara pressed her lips together. She straightened her back. She walked in. She got as far as the 3rd shelf before her legs stopped cooperating. It happened without warning. Not a stumble, not a dramatic collapse, but a slow and total failure of her body to continue. Her knees went first. She caught the bedpost with one hand and stood there for a moment, gripping carved oak, breathing through her nose, telling herself sternly that she was perfectly fine and that she simply needed to stand up straight and take the ledger and go. Her body disagreed. The fever she had been outrunning since Tuesday, the ache behind her eyes, the tightness in her chest, the way the summer heat had felt wrong all week, Too close, too personal hit her all at once, and Clara Whitcomb sat down on the edge of Nathaniel Whitaker's bed because there was nothing else to do. She would rest for one moment, only one. Then she would get up. She did not get up. Nathaniel Whitaker came back to his rooms at 9:30. He had been in the South Garden with James Bellamy for 2 hours longer than intended, going over the terms of a land agreement that James kept finding new ways to make complicated, and by the time he climbed the West Wing stairs, he was tired in a way that lived behind his eyes and pressed down on his shoulders. He was 34 years old. He had managed the Whitaker estate for 6 years since his father's death, and there was not a single morning of those 6 years in which someone had not needed something from him before he had finished his first cup of coffee. He pushed open the door to his bedroom. He stopped. There was a woman asleep on his bed. Nathaniel Whitaker stood in the doorway for a full 10 seconds and did nothing. He was not a man who reacted without thinking. His father had taught him that, or rather his father's volatility had taught him its opposite in the particular way that sons learn from watching what they don't want to become. He looked at the woman. She was young, slight, under the bulk of her servant's apron and dress, one hand still gripping the bedpost with a loosened fist, as though she'd intended to hold on and simply forgotten. A candle holder lay on its side on the floor beside her, and on the shelf above her, his second shelf blue cover, the household ledger sat precisely where it always sat. He looked at the ledger. He looked at her. He understood slowly what had happened. Nathaniel stepped inside and closed the door behind him with care. He did not call for Mrs. Hale. He did not raise his voice. He crossed the room, set the candle upright, and stood at the foot of his own bed, looking at a woman he had never spoken to in his life, and did the one thing that no one who worked in this house would have predicted of him. He let her sleep. "You don't know her name," James Bellamy said the following morning, with the tone of a man who found other people's business endlessly entertaining. "I know she's one of Mrs. Hale's," Nathaniel said, without looking up from the paper in front of him. They were at breakfast, or Nathaniel was at breakfast. James had arrived uninvited before 8, which was becoming a habit. "New hire. Came up from Charlottesville. And she wandered into your private rooms and fell asleep in your bed. She came for the ledger. The door was open." Nathaniel turned a page. "She's unwell. It was evident." James leaned back in his chair with the particular ease of a man who had never once in his life worried about anything. He was Eleanor's brother, which meant he had grown up in drawing rooms, learning how to make discomfort feel like sport. "Nat," he said, "you understand what it looks like." "I understand what it is," Nathaniel said. "A tired woman who misdirected herself and needed rest. Your household staff is going to talk." "My household staff talks regardless." Nathaniel set the paper down. He looked at James directly the way his father had never managed the steady look that didn't escalate, but also did not yield. "She stays on. Whatever wages she lost yesterday, Mrs. Hale will account for. And if I hear that anyone in this house made her position difficult over this, James, I will have something considerably more pointed to say than what I'm saying now." James raised both hands in surrender. He was smiling. "You're a strange man, Nathaniel." "So I've been told." Clara heard about it from Dottie. She was in the kitchen, standing over the washtub, with her arms submerged to the elbow, when Dottie appeared at her shoulder with the carefully controlled expression of someone delivering news they are not entirely sure is good or bad. "Mrs. Hale wants you," Dottie said. Clara went cold. "When?" "Now." "And Clara." Dottie hesitated. She was a kind girl younger than Clara by 2 years, with an honesty that sometimes made her clumsy. She didn't look angry. "I don't think you're being let go." Clara dried her hands. She did not say what she was thinking, which was that she had nowhere to go if she was, and that the thought of another road leading away from another household sat in her chest like a stone she had been carrying too long to feel anymore. Mrs. Hale was in her office, a small room off the main corridor furnished simply every surface clear and ordered. She was a woman of 50-something with gray-streaked hair and the posture of someone who had built her authority through 40 years of refusing to be underestimated. She looked at Clara for a moment before speaking. "Sit down, Miss Whitcomb." Clara sat. "You entered Mr. Whitaker's private rooms last evening." "Yes, ma'am. I misunderstood the direction. I believed... I know what you believed. Mrs. Hale's voice was not unkind. It was precise. You believed I said the West Wing study. I said the East Wing study. The error was yours. Yes, ma'am. You were also feverish. You had been feverish since at least Tuesday by my observation, and you did not report it. Clara said nothing. I need you to understand something, Miss Whitcomb. Mrs. Hale folded her hands on the desk. I run this household. That means every person in it is my responsibility, including you. If you are unwell, you tell me. You do not carry it alone until you collapse in a place you shouldn't be. I didn't want to be a burden. You are not a burden. You are staff. There is a difference. Mrs. Hale looked at her with an expression that Clara could not quite read. Mr. Whitaker spoke to me this morning. Clara's hands tightened on her apron. He asked that your wages from yesterday be honored in full, since the error in direction was a household error. He also asked that you be given 2 days of rest before returning to duties. A pause. He said you were clearly dedicated to your work, and that dedication of that kind shouldn't go unacknowledged. The room was very quiet. He said that, Clara said finally. He did. Clara had been thanked before. She had been called diligent, reliable, competent. But she had never, not once in 6 years of service, been told by the master of a household that her work was something worth acknowledging. The words sat strange and heavy in her chest, like something she didn't have the right shape for. I don't require 2 days, she said. Miss Whitcomb. 1 day, perhaps. I can... Clara. Mrs. Hale's voice went quiet in a way that stopped her. Take the 2 days. That is not a request. She spent the first day in her room, which was small and simply furnished, and looked out over the kitchen garden. She slept more deeply than she had in months. When she woke, it was afternoon, and the light through the window was the particular gold of a Virginia summer that hadn't yet decided to become brutal, and Clara lay still for a long time and did nothing at all. She was not accustomed to nothing. Nothing felt suspicious, like a trap. On the second day she was restless enough to sit up, and she went down to the kitchen garden because movement helped, and because the garden was the one place on the estate she had been given any latitude to do as she liked. She had reorganized the kitchen herb beds in her 3rd week without asking permission because the thyme was choking the sage and no one else had noticed. Cook had not said anything which Clara had taken as tacit approval. She was crouched between the lavender rows with her hands in the dirt when she heard footsteps on the path and looked up. Nathaniel Whitaker stood 4 feet away, looking at her with the expression of a man who had not expected to find anyone here. Clara stood up too fast and nearly went sideways. She pressed her hand against the nearest post. Sir, she said. I beg your pardon. I'll go. You don't need to go, he said. He said it plainly without softening it or complicating it. He was taller than she'd registered in her feverish memory of that first night, tall and angular, with the kind of sun-weathered look of a man who didn't spend all his time in the house. He was in shirt-sleeves jacket, left somewhere behind him, and there was ink on his left hand that he hadn't noticed. You're feeling better, he said. It wasn't quite a question. Yes, sir, thank you. For the wages and the time I didn't expect. You don't need to thank me. I do, though, Clara said before she could stop herself. Her voice was steadier than she felt. No one has, that is to say, most houses. She stopped, pressed her lips together. It was a kind thing. I wanted you to know I understand that. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with an attention that wasn't intrusive exactly, but was specific in a way she wasn't used to from anyone above her station, as though she had said something that required real thought. How long have you been in service? He asked. Since I was 16, sir. 6 years, then? Yes. And you've never taken a sick day. It wasn't quite a question either. Clara felt something shift in her chest, a small defensive movement like a door pulled closed. I've managed. I believe you, Nathaniel said. He reached out and broke a stem of lavender from the nearest row, turned it in his fingers without looking at it. My father ran this estate for 30 years on the principle that the people who worked for him were fortunate to work for him. He didn't think acknowledgement was something they required. A pause. I disagreed with him on that point. I disagree with him on several points." Clara didn't know what to say to that. She stood in the garden with dirt on her hands and looked at a man who was speaking to her like she was a person with an opinion worth hearing, and felt the particular disorientation of someone handed something they had stopped expecting. "The garden is well kept," he said after a moment. "I reorganized the herb beds," Clara said. "I hope that wasn't 'I didn't ask first and I should have.'" "The thyme was choking the sage," she blinked. "Yes, exactly." He glanced down at the lavender in his hand. Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. "You have a good eye." He set the lavender stem carefully on the post beside her and walked back toward the house. Clara stood in the garden for a long time after he was gone. Eleanor Bellamy arrived on Thursday with 3 trunks a lady's maid, and the particular energy of a woman who considered any house she entered to be already hers. She was Nathaniel's cousin, distantly on the Bellamy side, though she spoke of the connection with a weight that implied something considerably closer. She was 31, beautiful in the way that required maintenance and expressed itself as entitlement, and she had been orbiting the Whitaker estate for 4 years, with an intention that everyone in the household understood perfectly, and no one named aloud. Clara heard about her arrival from Dottie. "She's requested the East Suite," Dottie said, appearing at Clara's elbow while Clara was folding linens. "And she's already told Mrs. Hale that the previous arrangement of the morning room is unsuitable." "The arrangement Mrs. Hale has maintained for 12 years, Clara said, carefully neutral. "The very same." Dottie lowered her voice. "She asked who reorganized the kitchen garden. I heard her ask. Someone told her it was you." Clara went still. And she said," Dottie's voice dropped further, "how charming that the new staff has opinions." The words landed the way they were designed to. Clara recognized the particular elegance of a dismissal that wrapped itself in pleasantry, the kind of thing women like Eleanor Bellamy could say with a smile, and then look surprised if you flinched. She finished folding the linen. "Thank you for telling me. Clara," Dottie touched her arm, "be careful around her. She doesn't like things that aren't where she expects them." Clara understood precisely what Dottie meant. She was not where Eleanor Bellamy expected her. She was out of position, out of proportion, and she had been noticed by the one person in this house whose notice Eleanor had been cultivating for 4 years. She smoothed the folded linen flat. "I'll be careful," she said. That evening, coming up the back stairs with a tray for the upper hall, Clara rounded the corner and nearly walked directly into Nathaniel. He caught her arm before the tray went sideways. She felt his grip firm, immediate the reflex of a man used to acting before he thought. And then he let go the moment she was steady stepping back to give her room. "I beg your pardon," Clara said. "My fault," he said. "I wasn't watching the corner." They stood in the stairwell with the tray between them, and Clara became aware with a clarity that had nothing to do with fever, that this was the 3rd time in 4 days he had spoken to her. That in 6 weeks at the Whitaker estate, she had not had a full conversation with any man of the house. That the way he was looking at her now, steady, uncomplicated, as though her presence in the corridor was simply a fact of the world and not a problem to be solved, was something she did not have a word for. "The East Suite," he said after a moment. "You've prepared it?" "Yes, sir. This morning." Miss Bellamy settled in. "I believe so, sir." He nodded. He was looking at the tray, not at her, at the small pot of chamomile Cook had added without being asked, because Cook, it turned out, had opinions about servants who pushed through fever without complaint. "You should be resting," he said. "I'm on duty, sir." "You were given 2 days." "It's been 2 days." He looked up. There was something in his expression that she couldn't parse. Not frustration, not amusement exactly, but something in the space between. "Clara," he said. She went very still. He had used her name, not Miss Whitcomb, not girl. Her name plainly as though it were simply the right word for her. "If you make yourself ill again," he said, "I will have to speak to Mrs. Hale about adjusting your schedule, and then she will have opinions, and I will have to hear those opinions. I would rather not." She stared at him. He took the tray from her hands, very calmly, turned and handed it to Dottie, who had appeared silently at the top of the stairs at some point, and was now standing with an expression of barely contained astonishment. "Miss Whitcomb is done for the evening," he said to Dottie. "Take this to the upper hall." And then to Clara, without waiting for argument, "Good night." He walked away. Clara stood on the stairwell landing and listened to the sound of her own breathing. Downstairs, through the walls, she could hear Eleanor Bellamy's voice, low and musical, and carrying the particular tone of a woman who was very good at making requests sound like commands. Clara pressed her hand flat against the wall. She was 22 years old. She had been in service since she was 16. She had been invisible in every house she had ever worked in, not because she failed, but because invisibility was what the work required. And she had learned that requirement the way she had learned all the others thoroughly, without complaint, without expecting anyone to notice the learning. Nathaniel Whitaker had said her name. She went to bed. She did not sleep for a long time. Eleanor Bellamy did not waste time. By Friday morning, less than 48 hours after her trunks had been carried upstairs, she had already rearranged the morning room, dismissed the particular arrangement of the breakfast table that Mrs. Hale had maintained for a decade, and requested that the household staff address her as Miss Bellamy rather than ma'am, which was a distinction no one had asked for, and everyone understood immediately. Clara understood it best of all. She had learned in 6 years of service that there were two kinds of difficult women in a household. The first kind were difficult because they were unhappy, and unhappiness made people sharp and ungenerous. The second kind were difficult because they were strategic, and strategy required them to be sharp in ways that looked accidental. Eleanor Bellamy was the second kind. Every correction she issued came wrapped in a smile. Every instruction arrived with just enough pleasantry to make pushback seem unreasonable. By Friday afternoon, Clara had been corrected 3 times. Once for the arrangement of the East Suite's writing desk. Once for the temperature of the water brought for Miss Bellamy's morning bath. And once the one that sat the wrong way in her chest for the kitchen garden. Eleanor had come out to the garden with a parasol and a companion expression, the kind that suggested she was simply passing through and certainly not looking for anything in particular. She had stood at the edge of the herb beds and said to no one specifically, "It's been changed." "Yes, Miss Bellamy," Clara said. She was at the far end of the row, hands in the soil, not looking up. "Who authorized that?" A pause. "No one, ma'am. I made the adjustment based on, Eleanor repeated with a soft amusement that was worse than argument, your own judgment. The time was overtaking the sage. The yield was, I'm sure it was all very sensible. Eleanor turned glancing down the row with an expression of pleasant dismissal. In future, Miss Whitcomb is it adjustments to the estate grounds should go through proper channels. This is not a kitchen garden at a boarding house. Clara looked up then. She did it deliberately, which was perhaps a mistake, but she had lived long enough to know that certain things had to be looked at directly, or they grew. Of course, Miss Bellamy, she said. I'll keep that in mind. Eleanor held her gaze for exactly 1 second longer than was comfortable. Then she turned and walked back toward the house, with the unhurried certainty of a woman who had never once in her life needed to hurry. Dottie appeared at Clara's elbow the moment she was gone. You looked at her, she whispered. I know. Clara, you looked right at her. I know, Clara said again. She pressed her hands back into the soil and kept working. Her jaw was tight. Her heart was going too fast. But her hands were steady, and she had learned long before she came to the Whitaker estate that steady hands were the only argument that lasted. What happened Saturday had nothing to do with Clara, or it shouldn't have. James Bellamy had brought a friend from Richmond, a Mr. Aldous Crane, who was the sort of man who treated a dinner table like a stage and everyone around it like an audience. He was loud in the way that money sometimes made men loud, not because he lacked manners, but because manners had never been required of him in any room he'd entered. He'd sat across from Clara at the edge of the servants' hallway she was passing through with the coffee service and said loudly enough for the table to hear, Good God, James, where did you find this one? She's built like a farmhand. The table went quiet. Clara kept walking. She had learned that too, that some things required you to keep moving because stopping gave them weight, and she could not afford to give this man the satisfaction of watching her absorb it in front of an audience. But she heard from the doorway Nathaniel Whitaker's voice. Mr. Crane. Not loud, not angry. Flat and even in the way that certain men's voices could go flat and mean something considerably more dangerous than volume. My apologies, Aldous Crane said with a laugh that didn't quite land. Only a jest. Miss Whitcomb manages this household service without error, Nathaniel said. If you'd like to comment on that, you're welcome to do so. If you'd prefer to comment on anything else, I'd ask you to wait until you've returned to Richmond. The silence at the table lasted 4 full seconds. Clara did not stop walking, but she heard it. She heard every word of it standing in the corridor with the coffee service in her hands, and she stood there for a moment with her eyes closed, and something moving in her chest that she did not immediately have a name for. When she came back into the kitchen, Cook looked at her once and said nothing, just poured her a cup of tea and set it on the counter and went back to her work. Clara drank it. The twist arrived on Sunday evening, and it came from the last direction she expected. She was in the upper hallway returning a tray when she heard Eleanor Bellamy's voice through the partially open door of the sitting room. She wasn't trying to listen. She was 3 feet past the door when her own name stopped her. Clara Whitcomb. Eleanor was saying in the tone she used for pleasantries that weren't pleasant. She's the one he went out of his way to defend, in front of Aldous Crane of all people. James Bellamy's voice lazy and unbothered. Nat's always had a particular sense of fairness. It doesn't mean anything. He used her name James. He uses everyone's name. He makes a point of it. You know how he is. I know exactly how he is. Eleanor's voice was measured and quiet, in a way that made Clara's skin go cold. I also know that she entered his private rooms and spent the night. I know that he chose not to report it, not to dismiss her, and not to inform me when I arrived. Those are 3 separate choices, and each one of them tells me something. You're reading into it. I'm reading it correctly. A pause, the sound of a cup being set down. She needs to be reassigned. Something that takes her out of daily proximity. The south pantry, the laundry rotation, anything that makes her less visible. Eleanor. She's a distraction, James. A very well-timed one, I'll grant her that, but a distraction. Her voice went soft, which was the register it dropped to when she was most serious. I've worked 4 years on this. I will not have it undone by a servant girl from Charlottesville with dirt under her fingernails. Clara stood in the hallway with the tray in her hands and felt the blood leave her face. She had known abstractly that Eleanor Bellamy found her inconvenient. She had not understood until this moment that she had been understood as a threat. She walked back to the kitchen. She set the tray down without dropping it, which took more control than she'd expected. She stood at the sink with her hands gripping the basin edge and stared at nothing. Dottie said from behind her, "Clara, what's wrong?" "Nothing," Clara said. And then, because Dottie would know she was lying, and because she was too tired to sustain the performance, "I need a moment." "Take it," Dottie said simply. Clara took it. She stood at the basin and thought about reassignment. She thought about what it meant to be made invisible by degrees, moved from room to room, until she was somewhere no one could see, doing work that required neither her judgment nor her name. She had been in houses like that. She had survived them. She was very tired of surviving. She didn't plan to speak to Nathaniel. She had no right to speak to him. No protocol that permitted it, no reasonable argument for presenting herself at the door of his study and opening her mouth. She did it anyway. Mrs. Hale would have said that was her greatest quality and her greatest liability in equal measure. She knocked twice. His voice from inside, "Come." He was at his desk, papers spread in front of him, sleeves rolled to the elbow. He looked up when she came in, and something shifted in his expression, not alarm exactly, but attention, the kind that came on quickly. "Miss Whitcomb," he said, "I apologize for the intrusion, sir." She stood at the door with her hands clasped, because clasping them meant they couldn't shake. "I need to tell you something, and I want you to understand that I'm not asking for anything. I'm not making a request. I simply think you should know." He set his pen down. He turned to face her directly. She told him what she'd heard. She said it plainly without embellishment, because she had long since learned that adding emotion to information gave people reasons to dismiss the information. When she finished, the room was quiet. "You heard this," he said. "Yes, sir." Through the sitting room door. I was passing. It wasn't intentional. He was quiet for a moment. Looking at her with that particular attention, she had started to recognize the kind that meant he was actually thinking about what she'd said, rather than deciding how to respond to it. How long, he said, have you been moving around this house making yourself small, so that no one has cause to complain about you? Clara blinked. That was not the question she had expected. I'm not sure what you reorganized the garden and didn't tell anyone. You were feverish for days and didn't report it. You carried a tray every evening for 2 hours after I told Mrs. Hale you were to rest. He wasn't accusing her. His voice was level and direct. How long have you been doing that? She looked at him. Since I was 16, she said finally. Sir, he was quiet again. She watched something move across his face, not pity, which she would have hated, but something more careful. Something that looked oddly like recognition. You're not going to be reassigned, he said. Mr. Whitaker, I don't want to cause difficulty between you and Miss Bellamy. You haven't caused anything. He picked up his pen. Eleanor has excellent qualities and a tendency to manage situations she doesn't control. This is not a situation she controls. He glanced up at her. Is there anything else? Clara stood in the doorway of his study in the summer evening, with the particular disorientation of someone who had come expecting to fight and found instead that there was nothing to fight. No, sir, she said. Thank you. Good night, Miss Whitcomb. She left. She had been back in the kitchen for less than 10 minutes when Mrs. Hale appeared, which meant news traveled fast in this house. Or Nathaniel Whitaker moved faster than she expected. Sit, Mrs. Hale said in the tone that was not optional. Clara sat. I've been asked, Mrs. Hale said carefully, to review your duties. Clara's stomach went tight. Your current assignment puts you in the East Wing, the Central Hall, and the kitchen garden. Mr. Whitaker has suggested that you might additionally take on coordination of the household provisioning schedule, the weekly ledger supplier correspondence inventory record. She paused. That is ordinarily a senior staff position. Clara stared at her. That's an expansion of your role. Mrs. Hale folded her hands. Not a reassignment. The distinction was precise and intentional, and Clara understood it completely. She had come to this house as a maid. She was being handed quietly and without ceremony a step toward something considerably more than that. Why? She asked before she could stop herself. Mrs. Hale looked at her for a moment. Because you're capable, she said. And because this house has wasted capable people before, and I don't intend to do it again. A pause that held more weight than the words around it. And because Mr. Whitaker asked. Clara sat with that. The weight of it. The strangeness of being seen by someone who had no reason to look. I'll do it well, she said. I know you will, Mrs. Hale said. That's why he asked. Eleanor found out on Monday morning. Clara knew because she heard the sitting room door close with a force that was technically not a slam, but communicated the same information. She knew because Dottie came into the kitchen with wide eyes and a look that said something significant had just happened. And she knew because James Bellamy appeared in the kitchen doorway at 9:30, looked at Clara with an expression she couldn't read, and said, You've got more nerve than I gave you credit for. I beg your pardon, Clara said, going to him directly. James tilted his head. There was something in his voice that was not quite admiration and not quite warning, but walked the line between them. Eleanor runs most conversations before they happen. She didn't run that one. Clara looked at him steadily. I didn't do anything underhanded, Mr. Bellamy. No, he agreed. That's exactly the problem from her perspective. He glanced toward the hall, then back. Watch yourself, Miss Whitcomb. My sister is gracious when she wins. When she doesn't, she's considerably more creative. He left. Clara turned back to the provisioning ledger that was now sitting on the kitchen table waiting for her first entry. Her hand was steady. Her jaw was tight. She opened the ledger. She picked up the pen. She had been told to watch herself before. By matrons who thought her too direct, by households that wanted her smaller, by a world that had spent 22 years explaining to her in various registers that her most useful quality was her capacity to disappear. She wrote the date at the top of the first page. She was done disappearing. It was Dottie who told her that evening what Eleanor had said to Nathaniel at dinner. She said it very sweetly. Dottie reported with the precision of someone who understood that sweetness was a delivery mechanism. She said she was concerned, only concerned, mind you, that certain staff members were developing attachments above their station, and that it reflected poorly on the household's management, and that she was sure Mrs. Hale would agree if properly consulted. And, Clara said, and Mr. Whittaker said Dottie's voice dropped to near reverence. He said, Eleanor, if you have a concern about my household management, I'd ask you to raise it with me directly and not dress it in other language. And then he asked her to pass the salt. Clara sat down. He asked her to pass the salt, she repeated. He did. Dottie sat down across from her, eyes bright. And she passed it. The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of the fire settling. Outside, the Virginia summer was pressing warm and close against the windows, the kind of evening that promised nothing and asked nothing and simply existed, which was its own kind of grace. Clara looked at her hands. She thought about a man who had found her asleep in his bed and chosen to let her sleep, who had said her name plainly without ceremony, as though it were simply the right word for her, who had in the space of 6 days done more to make her feel like a person with standing in the world than any house she had ever worked in. She was 22 years old, and she was not naive. She knew the distance between a servant and the master of an estate. She knew it in her bones, the way she knew the layout of every house she'd ever worked, by necessity, by survival, by the understanding that knowing your limits was what kept you safe. But she also knew, sitting in the kitchen with the provisioning ledger in front of her, and Dottie looking at her with an expression that was trying very hard not to mean too much, that something had shifted in the Whittaker estate in the past week. She didn't know yet what to do with that. She opened the ledger. She read the first entry she had written that morning in her own hand, neat and certain. She turned to the second page. She began. The provisioning ledger changed things in ways Clara hadn't anticipated. She had expected the work to be clerical columns of numbers, supplier names, inventory counts. And it was those things. But it was also, she discovered within the first 3 days, a record of every way the Whittaker estate had been quietly hemorrhaging money for the better part of 2 years. She didn't say anything immediately. She sat with the ledger for 4 evenings, running cross-referencing supplier invoices against delivery records, checking quantities ordered against quantities received, and doing the arithmetic twice, because she didn't trust a number until she'd counted it from 2 directions. When she was certain, she brought it to Mrs. Hale. The grain supplier, she said, setting the relevant pages on Mrs. Hale's desk. We're being invoiced for quantities that don't match what's arriving. The gap is small enough that it doesn't stand out month to month, but over 2 years. She had written the total at the bottom of her notes in a clear, even hand. It's significant. Mrs. Hale looked at the number. She looked at it for a long time. How long have you been looking at this? She asked. 3 days. And you're certain? I've checked it 4 times. Mrs. Hale sat back. She had the expression of a woman who had suspected something was wrong for a long time and was now experiencing the complicated feeling of being proven right. I'll bring this to Mr. Whittaker, she said. I thought it should come from you, Clara said. It should come from you, Mrs. Hale said plainly. You found it, you documented it, you bring it. Clara took the ledger to his study that same evening. She knocked. She came in when he said to. She set the pages on his desk without preamble and waited while he read. He read slowly. He turned pages without speaking. At one point he stopped, went back, read a section again. When he looked up, his expression was controlled in the way it went, controlled when something had genuinely landed. You found this in 3 days, he said. Yes, sir. The estate has employed a provisioning manager for 2 years. Yes, sir. He looked at the number at the bottom of her notes. He looked at it the same way Mrs. Hale had, not with shock, but with the particular expression of a man recalibrating something he thought he knew. I'll contact the supplier Monday morning, he said, and I'll need you to prepare a full audit going back to the initial contract. I can have it done by Sunday evening. He paused. You don't have to work through Sunday. I don't mind, she said. And then, because she had promised herself she was done making herself small, I'd like to finish it. It matters that it's thorough." He held her gaze for a moment. "All right," he said. "Sunday evening." She was at the door when he said, "Miss Whitcomb." She turned. "This is good work," he said. "Not adequate work. Good work. There's a difference." She nodded. She left. She stood in the corridor outside his study and pressed her back against the wall and breathed. She was not going to make anything of that. She was absolutely not going to make anything of that. She made her way back to the kitchen and opened the ledger and worked until midnight. Eleanor came to find her on Saturday. Not in the garden, not in the corridor. She came to the kitchen, which was a thing Clara had never seen a woman of Eleanor's standing do without a specific performative reason. She came in with her hands folded and her expression arranged in the particular configuration that meant she was about to be kind. "Miss Whitcomb," she said. "I wonder if I might have a word." Cook went very still at the stove. Dottie vanished with impressive speed. "Of course, Miss Bellamy," Clara said. Eleanor sat down across the kitchen table from her, actually sat, which was disarming enough that Clara felt her guard go up before she understood why. "I want to apologize," Eleanor said. "For the garden. I was dismissive, and that wasn't fair. You made a sensible improvement, and I made you feel as though your judgment wasn't valued." Clara looked at her. "I appreciate that, Miss Bellamy. I also want to be honest with you." Eleanor's voice shifted, stayed pleasant, but went direct in a way that felt closer to the real conversation. "I've been coming to this estate for 4 years. Nathaniel and I, we understand each other. There's a history between our families and a future that makes sense for everyone involved." She paused. "I'm not saying this to be cruel. I'm saying it because I think you're a practical woman, and practical women understand when a situation has a shape." Clara was quiet for a moment. "What shape is that?" she asked. Eleanor smiled. It was a beautiful smile. "The kind where everyone stays where they belong," she said, "and everyone is better for it." Clara looked down at the ledger in front of her. She thought about the 2-year discrepancy in the grain invoices. She thought about the kind of woman who spent 4 years orbiting a man and called it a future. She thought about Nathaniel Whitaker saying good work, not adequate work, good work. "I understand you, Miss Bellamy," she said. She met Eleanor's eyes. "I appreciate the honesty." Eleanor held the look for a beat, then nodded once and stood. "I thought you might." She moved toward the door. "You're a capable woman. I genuinely mean that. I hope it serves you well wherever you land." She left. Cook let out a breath. "Lord in heaven," she said to the stove. Clara turned back to the ledger. Her hand was shaking slightly. She pressed it flat on the page until it stopped. "Wherever you land," as though she were already falling. She wasn't falling. She was sitting in a kitchen on a Saturday morning, with a ledger full of evidence that she had earned her place at this table, and she was going to finish the audit, and she was going to deliver it Sunday evening, and she was not going to let Eleanor Bellamy's very elegant attempt to displace her do anything except make her press harder. She picked up the pen. She kept working. Sunday evening arrived, and with it the twist that Clara had not seen coming, because it didn't come from Eleanor, and it didn't come from James, and it didn't come from anywhere she'd been watching. It came from Nathaniel himself. She brought the completed audit to his study at 7 o'clock. It was thorough, every invoice cross-referenced, every discrepancy, dated and documented, a clear, numerical summary at the front, and the supporting evidence organized chronologically behind it. She had worked 12 hours on Saturday and 8 on Sunday, and she had not let herself think about Eleanor's kitchen visit while she did it, because the work was the answer, and she knew it. He took it. He read the summary first, then paged through the supporting documentation with a focus that told her he was reading it in full, not skimming. She stood. She waited. When he set it down, he didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "Sit down, Miss Whitcomb." She sat. "I'm going to tell you something," he said, "and I want you to hear it completely before you respond." Her stomach tightened. "All right. My father had a steward," he said. "Managed the estate for 20 years. Good man by most measures. But he ran this house on the principle that information was power, and power stayed at the top, which meant that anyone below a certain level staff tradespeople servants was managed, not consulted. Their knowledge was used, but never acknowledged. He paused. I have been looking for someone to take on an expanded stewardship role for this estate for 8 months. I have interviewed 6 candidates, all of them referred by other Virginia estate families, all of them men with appropriate credentials. Clara sat very still. None of them found what you found in 3 days, he said, in 2 years of access to these records. The room was very quiet. I'm not offering you a proposal, he said, and his voice was careful in a way that told her he understood exactly what he was saying and what it sounded like. I'm offering you a position. Assistant Estate Steward, formal title, formal wage, formal, standing in this household, with the understanding that it is earned, not given, and that I expect exactly the quality of work you have already demonstrated. He stopped. That is what I'm offering you. I want to be clear about that. Clara looked at him. She thought about 6 years of making herself small enough to fit into other people's idea of what she should be. She thought about Eleanor Bellamy's smile and Wherever You Land. She thought about Dottie's face when she had looked at her in the stairwell, trying not to mean too much. Why are you telling me this now? She asked. Because, he said, I have been watching you work for 2 weeks and I don't want to wait 8 more months to find out what you can do if someone gives you the room to do it. You don't know me, she said. Not a protest, a genuine observation. I know what you did with the garden. I know what you did with the ledger. I know that you were feverish for a week and didn't complain once, and I know that when Eleanor Bellamy spent 4 days making your position in this house difficult, you responded by finding a 2-year accounting fraud. He looked at her steadily. I know enough. Clara was quiet for a long moment. What will people say? She asked. Not for herself or not only for herself. She was asking because he would have to answer for it, and she was not willing to let him walk into that without knowing she understood the cost. People will say a great many things, Nathaniel said. They generally do. Eleanor manages her own life, he said. She has done so with great competence for 31 years and will continue to do so without my participation. He said it without cruelty, without drama, just fact delivered clean. My concern is this estate and the people who keep it. That concern includes you. Clara looked at her hands. The hands that had been in soil and ledger pages and wash tubs and trays and every form of work this house required for 6 straight weeks without acknowledgement from anyone except the man currently sitting across from her. I'll need to think about it, she said. He nodded. Take until tomorrow morning. She stood. She was at the door when something stopped her. Not a sound, not his voice, just the weight of what she was walking away from and what she was walking toward. She turned. Why did you let me sleep? She asked. That first night, you could have woken me. You could have called Mrs. Hale. Why didn't you? He was quiet for a moment. Because you needed the rest, he said simply. That's all? That was enough, he said. Clara left. The next morning at breakfast, Eleanor Bellamy made her move. Clara heard about it from Dottie, who had been refilling the coffee service, and who came back to the kitchen with the expression of someone who had witnessed something that required immediate reporting. She told him, Dottie said breathless, in front of Mr. Crane and Mr. Bellamy both, that she had serious concerns about a member of staff being given authority inconsistent with her position, and that she felt it reflected a lapse in household judgment that could damage the estate's standing in Virginia society. She said that, Clara said. She said it very graciously. That was the worst part. And Dottie took a breath. He set his fork down, very slowly. And he said, Clara, he said it so quietly the whole table went still to hear him. He said, Eleanor, the estate's standing in Virginia. Society is not your concern. Miss Whitcomb's position in this house is not your concern. And I would ask you sincerely to let this be the last conversation we have on the matter. Clara sat down. He said that, she said. At the breakfast table. In front of everyone. Dottie's voice was barely above a whisper. And then he picked up his fork and kept eating. The kitchen was absolutely silent. Cook said to the ceiling. Well. Clara looked at the provisioning ledger still open on the table where she'd left it the night before. She looked at the first entry in her own handwriting, neat and certain. She thought about Eleanor's face in this kitchen 2 days ago, the beautiful smile, the precise language wherever you land. She thought about Nathaniel Whitaker eating his breakfast. She stood up. She crossed to the kitchen window. She stood there for a moment, with the Virginia summer pressing warm and close outside, thinking about 6 years of roads that had all led away from somewhere, and the particular strangeness of standing still. James Bellamy appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at her with the expression he'd worn the first time, that unreadable combination of warning and something almost like respect. "You should know," he said without preamble, "that Eleanor is going to write to 3 families she knows in Richmond. She's going to tell them that Nathaniel's household management has become irregular." "Why are you telling me this?" Clara said. "Because," James said, "I told her not to, and she didn't listen to me. And I find that when Eleanor is wrong, I like to make sure someone else knows it first." He paused. "She's wrong about you. I think she's known it since the garden." He left. Clara stood in the kitchen. She thought about 3 families in Richmond. She thought about the word irregular and all the shapes it could take in a letter from a woman like Eleanor Bellamy. She thought about what it would cost Nathaniel, a man who had built something real in the 6 years since his father died. Something worth protecting if she said yes to his offer, and it was used as a weapon against him. She thought about what it would cost her if she said no. She went to find Mrs. Hale. "J'étais." Mrs. Hale listened without interrupting. This was one of her qualities that Clara had come to rely on. She let a thing be said completely before she responded to it, which was rarer than it should have been. When Clara finished, Mrs. Hale said, "What is it you want, Miss Whitcomb? Not what you're afraid of losing. What do you want?" Clara had not been asked that in a long time. She thought about the provisioning ledger. She thought about the kitchen garden, the thyme and the sage, the small correction that had made things grow better. She thought about a blue-covered ledger on a second shelf, and a door that had been left slightly open, and the particular chain of accidents and choices that had led her from a boarding house in Charlottesville to a kitchen table in Virginia, where a man had asked her quietly and without ceremony to be more than she had ever been allowed to be. "I want to do the work," she said. "I want to do it here. I want to do it where someone can see it." Mrs. Hale nodded. Just once. As though that was the answer she had expected, and also the only one she would have accepted. "Then tell him yes," she said, "and let everything else be exactly what it is." Clara walked back to the kitchen. She looked at the ledger. She looked at the date she had written on the first page. She thought about Nathaniel Whitaker, who had found her asleep in his bed, and decided without being asked that what she needed most was rest. Who had said her name plainly? Who had, at a breakfast table in front of witnesses, spoken her name like it was worth defending? She closed the ledger. She went to tell him yes. She found him in the south corridor, not his study. He was coming back from the stables, jacket over one arm, and he looked up when he heard her footsteps and stopped. Just stopped the way he did, without the performance of stopping, without making anything of it. He simply waited. "Yes," Clara said. That was all. One word, standing in the corridor with her hands at her sides, because she had learned by now that this man did not require decoration around the things that mattered. He looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his expression, not surprise, but something quieter than that. Relief, maybe, though she wasn't certain she had the right to read it that way. "All right," he said. "I want to be clear about something," she said, because she had promised herself she would say this part too. "I'm saying yes because the work is worth doing, and I can do it well, not because of anything else." "I know that," he said. "And if it causes difficulty, if Eleanor's letters do what James thinks they'll do, I need you to know I understand the cost of that. I'm not walking into this without understanding it." He tilted his head slightly. "Are you asking me if I've considered the consequences?" "Yes." "I have," he said. "Have you?" She hadn't expected him to turn it back that way. She held his gaze. "Yes." "Then we're both going in clear," he said. "That seems like a reasonable place to start." He walked past her toward the house. He said without turning, "Mrs. Hale will have the formal documentation prepared by Wednesday. Your new wage takes effect Monday." Clara stood in the corridor and let the summer air settle around her. She had said yes. She had meant it. And somehow standing there it felt less like a risk than like the first decision she had made in 6 years that was entirely her own. The letters Eleanor sent to Richmond arrived at their destinations by Wednesday. Clara knew this because James told her with the particular expression of a man delivering bad news he had tried to prevent and felt personally responsible for anyway. He found her in the provisioning office, a small room off the main corridor that had been reassigned to her that morning. The first room in any house she had ever worked in, that was hers. 3 families, he said, leaning in the doorway. The Hargraves, the Callaway Marshes, and the Denbys, all significant in Richmond's social circles. Eleanor told them that Nathaniel has elevated a servant woman to a position of household authority in a manner inconsistent with proper management. He paused. She was careful not to say anything that isn't technically true. She's very good at that. Clara set her pen down. What do you think they'll do with it? Talk, James said, which is the only thing Eleanor actually needs them to do. And Nathaniel? James was quiet for a moment. Nat has never cared about Richmond's social circles the way Eleanor needs him to care. That's always been the problem from her perspective. He looked at Clara with an expression that was getting harder to read the better she knew him. But there's a business angle. The Hargraves have a standing land agreement with the estate. If they pull it over this... I know, Clara said. She did know. She had already run the numbers. The Hargraves agreement represented a significant portion of the estate's seasonal revenue. She had seen it in the ledger. She had been looking at it for 2 days since James had first mentioned the letters, knowing it was coming. How bad is it? James asked quietly. Bad enough to matter, Clara said. Not bad enough to break anything. If he moves quickly on the grain supplier restitution, the gap can be covered. She looked at him. He needs to move on it this week. James nodded slowly. He pushed off the doorframe. I'll tell him. Tell him I'll have the full financial projection on his desk by this afternoon. He paused. Clara. He used her name for the first time. It landed differently than she expected, not like Nathaniel saying it, which felt like being seen, but like acknowledgement from someone who had been skeptical and was revising. For what it's worth, I told her not to send those letters. I know you did, she said. He left. Clara picked up her pen. She opened the ledger to the grain supplier section and started writing the projection. Her hand was steady. Her chest was not entirely, but her hand was, and she had learned a long time ago that steadiness was a choice you made with your body while your feelings caught up. The projection was on Nathaniel's desk by 2 o'clock. By 3, he had read it. By 4, he had sent a rider to the grain supplier's office in Fredericksburg with a letter that Clara had drafted, that Mrs. Hale had reviewed, and that Nathaniel had signed without changing a single word. She didn't know that last part until Mrs. Hale told her that evening, with the particular tone she used, when something had surprised her and she was deciding whether to let it show. He signed it exactly as written, Mrs. Hale said. He said, and I am quoting precisely, she said it better than I would have. Clara looked at the fire. She looked at it for a long time. Mrs. Hale, she said, can I ask you something? You can try. Did you know this was coming? When you hired me when you brought me on from Charlottesville, did you have any sense that things would... She stopped. She didn't have a clean way to end the sentence that didn't sound like she was asking something she had no business asking. Mrs. Hale considered this with the seriousness she gave everything. I hired you, she said finally, because you had good references from a difficult household, because you had managed a full domestic staff at 20 years old, and because when I interviewed you, you asked me 3 questions about the estate's operational structure before I had a chance to ask you a single thing about yourself. She paused. I didn't know what was coming, but I knew you were not ordinary, and this house needed something that was not ordinary. Clara sat with that. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet, Mrs. Hale said. Eleanor hasn't played her last card. She played it on Thursday. Clara was in the main hallway when Eleanor descended the staircase with her traveling coat on and her lady's maid 2 steps behind her, and the expression of a woman who had decided very deliberately to make her exit visible. She stopped on the bottom step. She looked at Clara. I hope... Eleanor said, in the voice she used when she wanted to sound gracious, and instead sounded like winter, "that this arrangement brings you everything you expect it to." Clara looked up at her. "I hope the same for you, Miss Bellamy." Eleanor's eyes moved over her once not cruelly, but with the particular assessment of a woman recalibrating a situation she had misjudged. Something shifted in her expression. Not defeat exactly. Something more honest than that. "You're not what I thought you were," she said. "No, ma'am," Clara said. "I reckon I'm not." Eleanor looked at her one moment longer. Then she descended the last step, walked past her without another word, and went through the front door. The house went quiet. From somewhere upstairs, James Bellamy said to no one in particular, "Well, that's that." Clara stood in the hallway and breathed. What she had not expected, what she had not let herself account for because accounting for it felt like tempting something, was how the house changed after Eleanor left. It changed quietly. The way temperature changes in a room when someone opens a window, not dramatic, not announced, but immediately felt. Dottie laughed more in the kitchen. Cook started leaving a cup of tea on Clara's desk in the provisioning office in the evenings without being asked. Mrs. Hale gave her a second key to the main records cabinet, which was not a small thing in the language of this house. And Nathaniel. Nathaniel started talking to her differently, not improperly, nothing that crossed the clear line between her position and his. But there was a quality to their conversations now that had not been there before, a directness that went both ways, a willingness on his part to ask what she thought, rather than simply relay what he'd decided. He would appear in the doorway of the provisioning office in the evenings when the house was quiet and ask about the supplier negotiation progress, and stay 20 minutes past the time it took to get that answer. Clara noticed. She noticed with the part of her that was sharp and honest, and refused to pretend it wasn't happening. She also noticed it with the part of her that had been burned before, not by romance, which had never had much room in the life she'd built, but by trust, which had. By the belief that a situation was stable when it wasn't. By the mistake of settling into a house as though it were hers, and then being reminded in whatever form that reminder took that it was not. She was careful. She was present and capable and direct in exactly the ways her position required, and she kept the rest behind a door she checked regularly to make sure it was still closed. Then Aldous Crane came back. He arrived on a Friday afternoon, without announcement, rode up to the front of the estate while Clara was reviewing delivery records on the front porch with one of the stable hands, and he saw her before she saw him. She knew this because of the expression on his face when she looked up, the particular expression of a man who had been embarrassed once and was deciding in real time whether to acknowledge it. He decided against it. "Miss Barr," he started, and she could see him not remembering her name. "Whitcomb," she said. She said it without heat and without flinching. Just the fact of it clean. "Miss Whitcomb." He dismounted. He had the bearing of a man who operated through performance, everything about him slightly elevated, slightly staged. "Is Whitaker in?" "I can check for you, Mr. Crane. You're welcome to wait in the front parlor." She said it as she would have said it to any visitor. Politely, directly, with the authority of someone whose job was to manage this house and who was managing it. She watched him absorb this. Watched him recalibrate against whatever he had expected, which was clearly not a woman he had publicly insulted, now standing on the front porch in a role that implied he would need to speak to her as an equal. He went inside. Clara sent Dottie to let Nathaniel know he had a visitor. Then she finished reviewing the delivery records because the records didn't care about Aldous Crane, and neither did she. When she came inside 20 minutes later, she heard them in the study. The door was not fully closed. She was not listening, she was passing, but she heard her own name, and she stopped. "She's still here," Crane was saying with the tone he used for observations he considered self-evidently significant. "She is," Nathaniel said. "Nat, the woman made you look like you were she made the whole dinner uncomfortable. You understand that defending a servant in that manner raises questions." "What kind of questions?" A pause. "About your judgment," Crane said, more carefully now, reading apparently something in Nathaniel's tone. "About what's appropriate. Aldous?" Nathaniel's voice was quiet and even. "Miss Whitcomb is the assistant estate steward of this property. She found a 2-year accounting fraud in her first week recovered the estate a significant sum in supplier negotiations, and has managed the household provisioning with more competence than anyone I've employed in 6 years. A pause. What you said at that dinner table was insulting and wrong. I said so at the time. I'll say it again now if you'd like. But I'm curious what questions about my judgment you think need answering. Silence. She is also, Nathaniel said after a moment, a person. That should have been sufficient on its own. Clara walked away from the door. She walked to the provisioning office and sat down at her desk and put both hands flat on the surface and sat there for a long moment without moving. She is also a person. Said to a man who had not treated her like one. Said without anger, without performance. Said the way Nathaniel said everything that mattered, which was quietly and completely, as though he'd thought it through to the end before he opened his mouth. She was not going to make anything of it. She was absolutely, completely, entirely going to have to decide what to do with the fact that she already had. That evening, Nathaniel came to the provisioning office. This was not unusual anymore. What was unusual was that he came without papers, without a question about the supplier negotiation, without the conversational anchor of estate business that they had both been using. She understood now to make these visits feel neutral. He came in. He sat in the chair across from her desk, the one she had placed there because she conducted meetings in this room, not because she had anticipated him sitting in it at 7 in the evening with nothing in his hands. Crane left, he said. I noticed, she said. I told him he was welcome to come back when he had something useful to contribute to the estate's interests. Clara looked at him. That was pointed. It was direct, he said. There's a difference. She almost smiled. She heard the echo of his own phrasing from weeks ago. Not adequate work, good work, there's a difference, and she thought not for the first time that this was a man who said things once and meant them permanently. I need to ask you something, he said. Her hands went still on the desk. And I need you to hear it the way it's meant, he said, which is carefully, not quickly. All right, she said. This house. He stopped, reconsidered. She watched him do it, which was its own kind of intimacy, watching a careful man decide he wasn't being careful enough. I have managed this estate for 6 years. In that time, I have made decisions about land and money and staff and supply chains, and I have made most of them alone, and they have been adequate. He said the word with a precision that told her exactly how he meant it. The last 3 weeks have not been adequate. They have been good, and the difference is you. Clara did not move. I am not telling you this to complicate your position, he said. I am telling you this because I have been, because something has been... He stopped again. He looked at his own hands. I am not accustomed to not knowing exactly what I mean to say. Take your time, she said quietly. He looked up. I think very highly of you, Miss Whitcomb. I think highly of your mind and your judgment and your steadiness, and I am aware that what I think is not a small thing in the context of this house and what it means for your position here. He held her gaze. I am not asking you for anything. I want to be plain about that. I'm telling you what is true because I have spent 6 years in this house telling things exactly as they are, and I'm not willing to stop doing that now. The room was very still. Clara looked at him. She thought about a door left slightly open in the west wing. She thought about a man who had found her asleep and decided that what she needed most was to be left alone to rest. She thought about 6 years of houses where she had been useful, but never necessarily capable, but never seen, and the specific disorienting experience of being looked at by someone who saw her clearly and looked anyway. You should know, she said, that I am also, I think... She stopped. She pressed her hands flat on the desk. I am also not very accustomed to not knowing exactly what I mean to say. Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile, or not only a smile. Something that lived deeper than that in the steadiness of a man who had been alone for a long time and was looking at the thing that had changed that without entirely meaning to. Well, he said. Well, she said. They sat in the provisioning office while the summer evening settled outside, and neither of them said anything else for a long moment, and neither of them needed to. It was Mrs. Hale who brought them back to earth as Mrs. Hale had a gift for doing. She appeared in the doorway at 7:30 with the expression she wore when she was about to say something that would resolve everything and cost someone something. "There's a letter from the Hargraves," she said to Nathaniel. "It arrived this afternoon. I've been holding it." She paused. "It's not what Eleanor intended." Nathaniel looked up. "Mr. Hargrave writes," Mrs. Hale said, with the particular restraint of a woman delivering good news, as though it were neutral news, because she had learned that hope was best served plain, "that he has heard from several sources about the estate's handling of the grain supplier fraud, and that he considers it evidence of exactly the kind of management he wants to align his interests with." She paused again. "He is extending the land agreement. He is also asking if the estate would consider taking on a consulting role for his own household provisioning." The room absorbed this. Nathaniel looked at Clara. Clara looked at the provisioning ledger. Cook's voice floated down from somewhere above them, to no one in particular. "Lord have mercy." Nathaniel stood. He crossed to the doorway. He stopped next to Mrs. Hale, who handed him the letter with the expression of a woman who had seen 30 years of this house and was not surprised by any of it. "Thank you, Mrs. Hale," he said. "Thank Miss Whitcomb," she said simply. "She wrote the letter you sent them." He turned. He looked at Clara across the length of the room. She looked back at him. "I reckon," she said quietly, "that we make a decent team." The corner of his mouth moved. "I reckon," he said, "that we do." The Hargrave letter changed the air in the Whitaker estate, the way a good rain changes Virginia in August. Not dramatically, not all at once, but deeply in a way that settled into the walls and stayed. By Friday morning, 2 more letters had arrived. One from the Callaway Marshes, who had heard from the Hargraves and wanted to discuss a similar consulting arrangement. One from a merchant family in Richmond named Tully, who had no prior connection to the estate, but had apparently been told by someone in the Hargrave household that the Whitaker estate had a new provisioning officer who had recovered a significant fraud in under a week and wanted to know if that officer was available for correspondence. Mrs. Hale brought both letters to Clara's office before breakfast. Clara read them twice. She set them down. She picked them up and read them again. "They're writing to me," she said. "They are addressing their inquiries to the estate," Mrs. Hale said precisely. "But yes, they are writing to you." Clara looked at the letters, at her own name written in ink by strangers who had heard about her work, and decided it was worth pursuing. She had been in service for 6 years. She had been recommended, passed from household to household based on what she could do. But she had never been sought. There was a difference between being useful enough to be kept and being good enough to be found. And sitting in her provisioning office on a Friday morning, she felt that difference in her chest, like a door opening somewhere she hadn't known was closed. "What do I do with them?" she asked. "You respond," Mrs. Hale said. "Professionally carefully and after speaking with Mr. Whitaker about what consulting arrangements the estate can support." She paused at the door. "And Clara, don't minimize what this is. This is not luck. This is what happens when someone does the work correctly." She left. Clara sat with the letters for another minute. Then she picked up her pen and began drafting responses because that was what you did when something good arrived. You met it with the same steadiness you brought to everything else, or it slipped through your hands before you understood it was real. She spoke to Nathaniel after breakfast. He read the letters standing at his desk, which was how he read things that mattered. Standing, not sitting as though he needed to be on his feet for news that required a decision. When he set them down, he looked at her with an expression she had learned to read over the past 3 weeks. The one that meant he was about to say something he had already thought through completely. "You understand what this means," he said. It was not a question. "It means the estate has a reputation." "It didn't have a month ago," she said. "It means you have a reputation," he said. "The estate benefits because you're attached to it. That's a different thing." He picked up the Tully letter. "The Tullys don't know this estate. They know what you did." Clara looked at him steadily. "Is that a problem?" "No," he said. "It's a fact, and facts should be named correctly." He set the letter down. "I want to talk to you about something." She waited. "The consulting arrangements," he said. If you take them on, this becomes a formal service the estate offers. That changes your role again, your title, your compensation, your standing with these families. He paused. It also means I need to be clear before this gets larger about what I want from you. What you want from me professionally, she said. He looked at her. Yes, he said. And the other thing, too. The room was very quiet. Clara had been waiting for this, not with dread, but with the particular alertness of someone who knew a conversation was coming and had been deciding for days what she wanted to say when it arrived. She had run it in her head a dozen times. She had been sensible and careful, and had reminded herself of every reason why the distance between her position and his was not a thing to be crossed without consequences. She had also been honest with herself alone in the provisioning office at midnight, with the ledger closed and the house silent about what she felt when he came through that doorway. Then say it, she said. The other thing. He looked at her directly the way he always did when he was saying something he meant entirely. I don't want you to be here because this is where you landed, he said. I don't want you to be here because Eleanor failed and the Hargraves wrote and circumstances arranged themselves in your favor. I want you to be here because you chose it, specifically and clearly, knowing what it costs and what it gives you. He stopped. And I would like to know whether being here for you could mean something beyond the work. Clara held his gaze. It already does, she said. She said it the same way he said things that mattered quietly, completely, without decoration. And she watched it land in him. Watched the steadiness in his face shift into something she had never seen there before. Something that was not controlled and not performed, and not the careful management of a man who had learned from his father's volatility to keep everything even. It was relief, plain and real, and 6 years in the making, or however long it had been since the last time Nathaniel Whitaker had let himself want something that wasn't the estate, or the work, or the next decision that needed making. All right, he said. His voice was different, not louder, quieter, actually. The way things went quiet when they settled into truth. All right? Yes. The twist that came next arrived not from Eleanor, not from Richmond, not from any direction Clara had been watching. It came from Charlottesville. A letter appeared on Tuesday addressed to Clara, in a hand she didn't recognize bearing the seal of a law office. She opened it at her desk with the particular caution she gave unfamiliar correspondence and read it twice before she understood what it was saying. The widow she had served, Mrs. Alderton, the woman who had died quietly in her sleep and left Clara without wages or reference, had not, as Clara had been told, died without a will. There had been a will. A legal document drawn up 8 months before Mrs. Alderton's death, witnessed and filed with a law office in Charlottesville. In it, Mrs. Alderton had left Clara Whitcomb a sum of money, not a fortune, but significant, and a written statement of character that the law office described as, in their careful legal language, unusually specific and warm. The letter had not reached Clara immediately, because the solicitor had spent 4 months attempting to locate her through the household she had left. He had only found her now because the Whitaker estate's name had begun appearing in correspondence across 3 Virginia counties, and someone in Richmond had mentioned in passing that the estate's new provisioning officer had come from Charlottesville. Clara sat at her desk with the letter in her hands and did not move for a long time. Mrs. Alderton had seen her. In a house where Clara had been invisible by design and by necessity, a 73-year-old widow in failing health had looked at her clearly enough to write about her by name in a legal document, had thought about her future with enough care to leave her something real, and had done all of this without telling her, without making it into a transaction or an obligation, or a thing Clara would have felt she needed to earn differently. She had just done it. Quietly. The way good things sometimes happened when no one was watching. Clara pressed the letter flat on the desk. She looked at the window. She sat with it. She thought about 6 years of roads leading away. She thought about the particular weight of having nothing behind you and nothing guaranteed ahead of you, and how that weight had become so familiar she had stopped noticing she was carrying it. She thought about the letter in her hands and Mrs. Alderton's name at the bottom, and the specific grace of being seen by someone who asked nothing back. She put the letter carefully in the top drawer of her desk. She closed the drawer. She stood up and went to find Nathaniel, because this was not a thing she wanted to hold alone. She found him in the South Garden. She told him about the letter plainly standing in the Virginia summer with the weight of it already lighter for having said it out loud. She watched his face as she spoke, watched him listen with the full attention he brought to things that mattered, not interrupting, not rushing toward a response. When she finished, he said, "She left this before she knew where you'd end up." "Yes." "She just trusted that you'd land somewhere that was right for you." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "She was a good woman," he said. "She was," Clara said. "I didn't know how good until now." He looked at her with an expression that had stopped being careful. That was just what it was, open and direct and entirely his. "What are you going to do with it?" Clara had been thinking about this since she'd read the letter. She had turned it over in the provisioning office in the kitchen at breakfast on the walk out to find him. She had thought about what it meant to have money that was hers. Not wages, not compensation. Hers. Given freely by someone who had believed she would know what to do with it. "There's a school," she said. "In Fredericksburg. I've read about it in the supplier correspondence, a small institution trying to establish a learning program for women in service. They need funding for a full first year." She looked at him. "I want to give it to them." He looked at her for a long moment. "All of it. Most of it," she said. "I'll keep enough to be sensible, but the rest—" She paused. "I spent 6 years wishing someone had given me the tools to do more than survive. If I can give that to someone else, that's the right use of it." He held her gaze. "Clara," he said. She looked at him. "You astonish me," he said. She felt it land not like a compliment, not like the diplomatic warmth she'd learned to deflect, but like the true thing it was. A man who did not say things he did not mean saying this, looking at her like she was the most real thing in his field of vision. "Don't make it more than it is," she said, though her voice was not entirely steady. "It is what it is," he said. "I'm naming it correctly." The hardest conversation came Thursday, and it came from James. He appeared in the provisioning office in the late afternoon with none of his usual performance, no casual lean against the doorframe, no practiced ease. He sat down in the chair across from her desk and looked at her with a directness she hadn't seen from him before. "Eleanor wrote to me," he said. Clara set her pen down. It's not another campaign. She's done with that." He paused. "She wanted me to know that she is aware she handled this badly. She didn't say it exactly in those words because Eleanor never says things in those words, but that's what she meant." He looked at his hands. "She also said, and this is the part I'm here to tell you, that she was wrong about you. Not wrong about her intentions, but wrong about you specifically. She thought you were a problem she could remove. She didn't understand that you were that what you are isn't removable." Clara looked at him for a moment. "What am I?" she asked. "The kind of person who changes things," he said. "She knows that now. She knew it, I think, when you looked at her in the garden. She just wasn't ready to admit it." He stood. "I'm not asking you to forgive her. I don't think she'd want me to ask that. I thought you should know that she saw it, in the end." Clara thought about Eleanor Bellamy's face in the kitchen. The beautiful smile, the precise language. "Wherever you land." "Tell her," Clara said, "that I hope she finds what she's looking for." James nodded. He turned to go. "James," she said. He stopped. "You're a better man than you let people see," she said. "That's a waste. You should let them see it." He stood in the doorway for a moment. Something moved across his face that was younger than his usual expression, less managed, more real. "Don't push it, Miss Whitcomb," he said, and left. Clara almost laughed. Almost. The night everything became official arrived without ceremony, which was exactly right. It was a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks after the Hargrave letter. 4 weeks after Eleanor's departure. 6 weeks after a woman had walked into a forbidden room in the West Wing and collapsed against a bedpost because her body had finally had enough of being asked to run on nothing. Nathaniel came to the provisioning office at 7 as he had every evening. He sat in the chair across from her desk, as he had every evening. But this time he set a document on the desk between them before he sat down. She looked at it. She did not pick it up immediately. "What is this?" she asked. "Read it," he said. She picked it up. It was drawn in formal legal language, witnessed and signed, bearing the Whitaker estate seal. She read it once. She read it again. It was a formal deed of partnership. Not employment. Not stewardship. Partnership. Her name beside his in the estate's official capacity, with equal authority over household management, provisioning operations, and external consulting. With a compensation structure that reflected in plain numbers exactly what her work had been worth to this estate and what it would continue to be worth. At the bottom in Nathaniel's handwriting below the formal language were 4 words that were not legal text and had no business being in a legal document and were there anyway. "If you'll have it." Clara sat with the document in her hands. She looked at those 4 words. She thought about every house she had ever worked in, every road she had walked away from, every room she had made herself smaller to fit inside. She thought about Mrs. Alderton's letter in the top drawer of this desk, and the school in Fredericksburg, and a blue-covered ledger on a second shelf that she had never been supposed to find. She looked up at Nathaniel. He was watching her with the particular patience of a man who had decided to stop being careful about what he wanted and was now simply waiting to see if the world would meet him. "You put it in writing," she said. "I do things correctly," he said, "or I don't do them. This is—" She stopped. She pressed her lips together. "This is more than I asked for." "You never ask for anything," he said. "That doesn't mean you don't deserve it." Clara looked at the document. She looked at his handwriting at the bottom. The 4 plain words in a careful hand from a man who had spent a month showing her action by action that he meant what he said and said what he meant. She picked up her pen. She signed her name beneath his. Dottie cried, which she had not expected to do, and denied afterward with great conviction. Cook produced a bottle of something from a cabinet that apparently no one had known existed. Mrs. Hale shook Clara's hand with both of hers and said simply, "Good," in the tone that meant everything. James, who had stayed on at the estate for reasons that had stopped being about Eleanor some time ago, raised a glass in Clara's direction across the kitchen, and said nothing which from him was the equivalent of a speech. Clara sat in the kitchen that evening with these people. Her people. She understood now the ones who had watched her work, and worried when she was feverish and brought her tea without being asked, and defended her to visitors who hadn't known her name and felt something she had not felt in 6 years of service. She felt at rest, not tired, not the temporary unconsciousness of a body that had run out of road. Actual rest, the kind that lives in the chest, in the settled certainty that you are where you are supposed to be, doing what you are supposed to do, surrounded by people who have seen you clearly and chosen to stay anyway. Nathaniel found her on the back porch later, when the kitchen had quieted. He stood beside her, without needing to fill the silence, which was one of the things she had come to understand about him, that he treated silence the way he treated everything, as something that had a right to be there if it belonged. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm better than all right," she said. He looked at her. The evening was warm, the Virginia summer doing what it did best. Pressing close and golden, the kind of night that asked nothing of anyone and gave everything anyway. "I owe you an apology," he said. She looked at him. "For what?" "For taking 3 weeks to put it in writing," he said. "I knew from the garden. I knew from the grain ledger. I kept waiting for a reason it wasn't what it was." "And there wasn't one," he said. "There was never one." Clara looked at him, at the man who had found her asleep in his forbidden room, and decided without being asked that what she needed was to be left in peace. Who had said her name like it was the right word? Who had defended her at a dinner table, and in a hallway, and in his own study, and at a breakfast table in front of witnesses every single time without calculation, and without fanfare, simply because she was worth defending? "Nathaniel," she said, his name plainly without title for the first time. He went very still. "I walked into the wrong room," she said, "and I found the right one. I reckon that's enough of a beginning for anyone." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he took her hand carefully, completely, in the manner of a man who did things correctly or did not do them, and held it and said nothing because nothing was required. Clara Whitcomb, who had spent 6 years making herself invisible in other people's houses, stood on the back porch of the Whitaker estate, on a Tuesday evening in the Virginia summer of 1815, with her name on a legal document and her hand in a good man's hand, and she was at last exactly where she had always deserved to be.